Time to me.
I think now we are recording. That's okay. Okay, good morning, good evening, everyone. I am really happy to be here today with all of you, and I am very, very happy that we are going to have a wonderful presenter and wonderful topic to talk about. Uh, it is wonderful because not because it was just a grant, it received a small grant of the APA Division 48, but because it is actually something that Dazzle has been working during his PhD, but also even earlier. So it is also uh, part of what he is intrinsically motivated to do, and it also has not just this scientific component where we are talking about trauma, PTSD, and coping in clinical psychology or in social psychology, but it also has this, I would like to say, like intrinsic component that is guiding him to do something that will lead to social activism and change. So this is research that actually leads towards the change. And somehow we all like to say that all of us are actually who are working on trauma are actually doing part of the research that is somehow me research or somehow connected to us or to people that we love. So I'm really, really honored to be here and to open this discussion with a wonderful PhD candidate from Howard University, Denzell Brown. And I also said who is also recipient of the APA Division 48 small grant for research in peace psychology. Although I think that this is like much broader than peace psychology, it is also including all other elements like a social activism and everything that can lead towards better life and betterment. So the topic is Black parents who lost their children to gun violence, post-traumatic stress growth, social activism, and meaning-focused coping. Denzel and I agree that he will first present for 25 minutes, and then like we will be all invited to ask questions, and I expect lots of questions for this topic. So Denzel, the floor is yours. I will mute myself now and just present.
Well, thank you for such a wonderful introduction. You don't get the time to reflect on some of the work you're doing until you hear it reflected back on you. Like a mirror sometimes. Just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Denzell Brown. I'm a Washington, D.C. native, and I'm currently a counseling PhD student at Howard University, like the introduction said. And I'll start by sharing my screen so we can go ahead and get started. If I can get a thumbs up to let me know if everyone can see this okay. Okay.
Great, we said.
All right. Um, so as was stated in the bio, my topic is particularly on post-traumatic growth, social justice activism, and meaning-focused coping among Black parents who lost children to gun violence. And the topic I picked for the name of this presentation is the brave behind the bullet. And I'll discuss more what that means, but just a quick introduction of what the brave behind the bullet it means, the experiences and the emotional baggage that comes with losing someone to gun violence. And that's also the name of an intervention program that I was able to cultivate from this work. But the first thing I would like to do is a land acknowledgement, just talking about violence and brutality and what is done to individuals that identify from, indigenous communities, marginalized communities. I'd like to start this presentation with a land acknowledgement. I am tuning in from Washington, D.C., which is the indigenous land of the Potomac people. Um, I like to, just ground our discussion in that because when we talk about gun violence and this intergenerational legacy of trauma, it can't be removed from some of the experiences that the people that have been mutilated, killed, and decimated into a certain degree and extent on the land I'm standing here today. So I just want to take a couple moments of silence to acknowledge that and to sit with that before getting started on this discussion. So I'll take 5 seconds to just appreciate that and give light to that. Okay, now that I took that time, we shall proceed. So the first thing I want to do is discuss, like I mentioned before on the slide prior, the Brave Behind the Bullet. The Brave Behind the Bullet is an organization that provides Black children who lost children, Black parents who lost children to gun violence in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, Maryland. And the following resources that I have been able to provide with this organization is offering these parents free individual psychotherapeutic services, trauma-informed yoga classes, restorative justice meetings, and also being able to host legal community testimonies in which parents who lost their children to gun violence are able to speak to local elected officials, whether that be a council member or just a stakeholder in the community. It could be an individual from an institution, perhaps a professor, or somebody doing some policy work that can really move the needle and make some changes to the population that's being affected. So this is an overview of what that phrase means, the babe behind the bullet, and the resources that are provided with this program. I also want to give credit and weight to my personal experiences and how it led me into this work, as it was stated in the introduction. Being a Washington, D.C. native, um, in the 1990s, Washington, D.C. was known as the murder capital of the United States. Similarly, Baltimore City was also identified as the murder capital throughout the early 1990s, mid 2000s. So what landed me in this work was this legacy of homicide being taking place and implemented in the areas in which I grew up in. Um, I know me personally, just growing up in Washington, D.C., I've had a range of about 8 to 10 people that I knew coming up that lost their lives to gun violence. So what really motivated me, inspired me to do this work is not only seeing people, youth that I knew, lose their life to gun violence, but also this lack of acknowledgement and concern from the parents of these youth. A lot of times, a lot of the interventions will focus on the youth and the kids, which I believe is important. But every youth has a parent that is responsible and that was affected by the loss of their life. And particularly, what motivated me as well was the absence of women from this conversation. We had high rates of Black young boys and young men getting killed. And but however, there was a lack of emphasis and a lack of concern and a lack of resource distribution towards some of the mothers that were impacted directly by their sons getting killed by gun violence. So originally, where it started was me seeing, a absence in care and concern for these Black women and Black mothers who lost children to gun violence in inner cities and didn't have sufficient access to psychotherapeutic care. In particularly one case that motivated me in particular, it was a young man by the name of Zaire Kelly, who I grew up with, came up an age with, and he lost his life to gun violence. Excuse me. And what was interesting was the attention in the media were heavily focused on he lost his life to another youth. And the media and attention was heavily focused on criminality surrounding youth, how youth are out of control, and there needs to be a stop to, violence in the communities, and there needs to be some control on addressing youth gun violence, youth delinquency with incarceration. And one of the things that, stood out to me about leading up to this point with several people I knew losing their life was that the response were focusing on incarceration rather than resource allocation. And that's what motivated me to get in this work. I thought if the parent who lost their children to gun violence was able to not have a keen emphasis and focus on detectives and individuals, whether it be surgeons or law sworn professionals, questioning them and berating them with information surrounding how can we incarcerate the person. that was responsible for your child's death. If that conversation can shift to what do you need? What type of therapeutic resources can we give you? How can we address this in a trauma-informed way? Can we help you pay for any funeral expenses? Can we get you involved in any, um, restorative programs? Then we might be able to see a change in how parents grieve and how parents experience some of the trauma that they endure in their communities. Um, so that motivated me back in 2020. And at this time, I was a graduating senior from Georgetown University. And I was able to publish a thesis looking at particularly Black mothers' experiences in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that also motivated me around this time was one of my personal experiences with gun violence. I had my car parked in the area not too far from my home, and it was individuals, a shooting broke out, and the back window of my car ended up getting, shot through. And this particular experience really it awakened me further and it pulled me closer towards the work because had I would have been in the car, I possibly could have been a victim of gun violence as well. And just having that experience, it motivated me to take a step forward to create the Brave Behind the Bullet initiative. So in 2021, we became an organization that offered parents these following resources. And since 2021, in these last 2 years, we've been able to provide 10 families in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore City with free individual therapy, yoga classes, and opportunities to speak to council members. We also been able to host a restorative justice meeting with violent offenders that's been convicted of crimes that focus on victimization of others with parents who lost their children to gun violence to give them the opportunity to express and express their concern to individuals that may have been responsible for any particular violent crimes in communities. And also over the past 3 years, another thing this organization has been able to do is host yearly testimony meetings with stakeholders. As I mentioned before, which we'll get into more throughout the presentation, this includes council members, surgeons, and also lawyers. So what we'll be discussing today is I'll be evaluating some of the aspects of my program in regards to post-traumatic growth, social justice activism, and also this idea of meaning-focused coping. So I'll summarize some of the essential elements of the program and how the effectiveness turned out, talk about some of the steps I took to evaluating the program, and review some of the standards of the effectiveness and address some areas of purpose and significance with this topic. So, some of the evaluation criteria I'll be discussing today is those yearly testimony meetings today. So I'll be looking at 3 yearly testimony meetings, which were hosted over the course of the last 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So the first meeting I'll look at is a meeting that the Brave Behind the Bullet had with Washington, D.C. council member in the Ward 5 region, in which we had 4 Black mothers talk about their experiences with losing children to gun violence and what policies can um, become created to help individuals in a particular experience with losing a child to gun violence. Second meeting we'll discuss is a meeting the organization had with Georgetown Law School and MedStar Hospital surgeons to talk about parents who lost their children to gun violence in their hospital experiences. A lot of times, parents within hospitals or emergency rooms are notified on the spot in a room with a lot of other people about the loss of their child. What is that has specific implications for what we know is HIPAA compliant concern, but also trying to cultivate some grief and trauma informed resources. What does it mean for parent to be notified of the loss of their child in a insensitive way? And the last meeting we had was recently in May with Georgetown Law School in the Office of Victim Services about taking a step further. How do police officers show up within hospitals when it comes to identifying the body, tampering with evidence, whether it be reporting evidence from the family that belonged to the victim? These are all essential aspects of the grieving process. So the scope of the meeting, each meeting was about 1 hour. Parents discussed their laws, resources, and policies that can be implemented to inform other families, but also they had the opportunity to talk about ways in which they've been able to make a difference, whether it be starting organizations devoted to other families or any other um, social justice work. And just to give you a sense of the demographic of the four Black mothers who lost their children to gun violence within um, Brave Behind the Bullet, it includes one mother who lost a sibling to police gun violence, another mother who lost two children to community gun violence, one mother who lost a spouse to gun violence, and one grandmother who lost a grandchild to gun violence. So, just a little background about the overall impact of firearm injuries. The Office of Victim Services report that each year over 200 people, 200,000 people are affected by homicides. However, particularly Black homicide survivors face racial and financial stigmas when it comes to seeking out psychotherapeutic or social services resources. And also, with this gap in care and disproportionality with resource access, we see that Black parents who lost children to gun violence suffer multiple health ailments if as it relates to having gastrointestinal problems, physical symptoms, cardiovascular complications, but also this instance of even 5 years after the loss, the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated grief disorder, with it being an extended period of time with individuals experiencing these adverse mental health outcomes. But one thing the literature is lacking and can speak more to is this aspect of Black parents who lost children to gun violence, finding ways to cope and to deal with in alternative ways to manage some of the intrusive and destabilizing effects of losing a child to gun violence without culturally competent resources. Um, and with in this particular population, three ways in which I'll discuss some of the mothers in my organization have been able to do that is through meaning focused coping, social justice activism, but also pursuing these post traumatic growth outcomes, which I'll explain in more detail in my next slide. So when I talk about post traumatic growth, the particular concept in which I'm referring to is when somebody experiences a traumatic event, and as a result of this traumatic event, individuals are able to have a positive orientation and transformation towards their life. And it's five areas in which the literature specifies that post-traumatic growth fosters or comes about. Now, this process doesn't occur in a vacuum or instantaneously. However, it occurs gradually. Some of the five aspects of post-traumatic growth that people um, have cited in the literature is includes, after enduring this traumatic event, they're able to embrace new opportunities on the personal and professional side. We also see that trauma survivors may have a heightened sense of gratitude towards life as a result of going through something traumatic, say being exposed to gun violence. These individuals have appreciation for what it means to still be a living being. Also, a greater spiritual connection. People rely on spirituality to manage and process some of the trauma and traumatic experiences that happen. And two other elements is this idea of improved personal relationships. A lot of times when individuals, particularly trauma survivors, are exposed to an intense and complex traumatic event, we see a lack of trust and also a protective mechanism that is produced among trauma survivors. However, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, we see that these individuals that have experienced the trauma are able to integrate some of the traumatic experiences that they have experienced and use these experiences to inform their personal relationships. And as a result of entering these relationships with these traumatic experiences, processed and integrated, and not avoided and suppressed, these individuals over time develop a sense of emotional resilience that occurs among trauma survivors as well. So these are five aspects in general that accompany post-traumatic growth. I want to stop and ask if anybody has any questions so far as I before I proceed. Right, I think I will continue. Okay, so social justice activism. When I refer to social justice activism, I'm referring to people advocating for others that don't have the voice or the power to do so. And this involves also recognizing the responsibility to combat some of the problems and injustices of society. And two elements and factors that relate to social justice activism is this idea of community organizing, but also advocacy. Um, Showing up in the community and finding ways, as I talked about before, whether it be creating grassroots organizations or just in general, providing individuals who've been impacted by gun violence similarly with resources. Secondly, when I refer to meaning focused coping, the definition that I'm using is an individual finding ways to draw on their values, beliefs, and core goals to reorder some of their life priorities and ascribe um, positive attributions towards life events. So this could include a simple motto that I hear people saying quite frequently: everything happens for a reason, or I know this is a part of a larger plan. Those are examples of people using meaning focused coping and focusing on the underlying meaning of some of the things that happen in their life to deal with some of the stress that occurs. So, some literature that is particular to Black parents who lost their children to gun violence I thought was helpful to orient our conversation today is um, some of the aspects surrounding grief. We know that losing a child to a firearm injury impacts parents for an extended period of time, even after the child's death, as I spoke about before, even 5 years post-mortem, post a child losing their life. We see parents are impacted in a myriad of ways. And some of these ways I want to give attention towards to discuss how this aspect of meaning focused coping, activism, and post-traumatic growth can come about. So it's aspect of post-traumatic stress. We see that after enduring traumatic experiences, some of the trauma reactions, whether it be reimagining an event in your head, hearing some of the voices or of the loved one that passed, being triggered by some of the loud sounds that may remind people of the instance of gun violence. We see some of these trauma symptoms also impact the grieving process. Some of the literature says that even up to 21 months post a child's homicide, that parents still endure some of these trauma reactions and also have to deal with this aspect of continual grief. And that's what we call, some literature has called this aspect of traumatic grief and prolonged grief that occurs among Black parents. And some of the literature on post-traumatic growth, while there hasn't been much literature on this topic pertaining to gun violence, we do see that some of the past literature has looked at hurricane survivors. And literature shows that, hurricane survivors, particularly in Louisiana, individuals that survived Hurricane Katrina, reported particularly a segment of Black parents have reported experiencing post-traumatic growth post Hurricane Katrina after their communities being damaged and several aspects of their lives being changed due to this traumatic event. You see people reporting this aspect of having a greater spiritual connection, uh, appreciation for new relationships, and a different orientation towards life as a result of this trauma that has occurred. So social justice activism, multiple studies has shown that grief-inspired activism has played a significant role in healing outcomes among Black parents. So the role of social justice activism cannot be eliminated from that conversation of also post-traumatic growth. And then meaning focused coping. We see that Black parents who lose their children to gun violence are able to reappraise the meaning of their child's death to go on to get involved, to give back to the community and find ways to ensure that another parent doesn't endure the experiences that they endure. So, as I said before, some of the evidence in the literature is heavily permeated with um, this deficit-based approach, a heavy focus on some of the what trauma and traumatic event does to trauma survivors, talking about some of the devastation and the meaninglessness that comes with parents experiencing this aspect of losing a child. They also talk about how the aspect of what it means to grieve as a mother and as a father. Some of the literature says that maternal grief is considered one of the most profound and persistent forms of grief that's been studied. And it's also an aspect of this literature that talks about how fathers grieving, it tends to show that fathers, when they're positioned grieving their child, they tend to conceal and suppress their emotions surrounding the grief. So while this contribution to the literature focusing on grief and traumatic stress is important, um, it helps us understand some of the underlying goals, underlying motives surrounding complicated grief and post-traumatic stress. However, one of the things that I think is missing from the literature is this aspect of post-traumatic growth and meaning-focused coping. There have been generations of Black parents predating uh, the civil rights movement, following the post-antebellum movement of abolition of slavery. We see that generations of parents in the United States have been making social justice efforts, creating grassroots organizations, engaging in aspects of meaning focused coping to find ways to deal with the trauma and the grief associated with losing a child. So one of the things I hope to do with the program that I'm speaking about today is to showcase how social justice and grassroots organizations can play a significant role in promoting post-traumatic growth. And only a small number of interventions in recent day has focused on this relationship between Black parents, meaning focus coping outcomes and also post-traumatic growth outcomes after losing a child. So some of the steps that I took to evaluating the effectiveness of my program was when I was looking at those three meetings, those yearly meetings we had with council members, hospitals, and also lawyers. Um, I reviewed the transcripts of these interviews, and that was one of the first steps. One of the second steps was identifying some of the themes that were present in these conversations that came from the direct voices of the survivors of gun violence, looking at these individuals as through a strength-based lens, not as victims, but survivors. The third step I took was selecting some of the theories that relate to some of the themes that have emerged in these transcripts. And the fourth thing I did is determine some of the outcomes that emerge from these themes and these theories being present. So, on the screen right now, one of the things that I thought were very interesting from the conversations we had over the yearly meetings, over a course of 3 years, meeting annually with council members, with surgeons, and law school professors and lawyers, we made a word map or word cloud, some people refer to it as, of all the most mentioned words that were present in this meeting. And one of the things that I found interesting about this word cloud is the most prevalent word and the most predominant word that was mentioned in this meeting was community, community, village, and neighborhood. And I find that interesting because during these meetings, we're talking about what it means for a parent to lose their child to gun violence and how that has impacted them with regards to police brutality, their rights being violated within hospital institutions. And the underlying words were community, neighborhood, and village. And just hearing that and seeing that from, creating this word map, it speaks to the importance of how meaning focused coping and social justice activism cannot be disentangled or separated from the institutions, the policies, and the practices that directly affect the families that are impacted by gun violence in these communities. So I thought this was an interesting thing that I wanted to share with you all today. Um, and also some of the themes that I noticed, one of the first ones which I'll speak towards directly is this aspect of traumatic loss. When these parents were talking about the death of their loved one, they talked about how individuals who also experience death as well is differentiated from an individual that may have lost their life from a terminal illness. And the three criteria that made that different was this instance of violence. We know that the perpetuation of gun violence is a violent act that is differentiated from a person passing away of natural causes or a terminal illness, but also volition. Another person took the volition and did an intentional act or unintentional act to do something to end a child's life. The third aspect was violation. A lot of the parents reported that they felt like losing their child felt like a violation of the natural order of life. We know that most parents don't expect to bury their children. Sometimes parents have the expectation that children will bury them. And once that role is reversed, it feels like a violation of what it means and the meaning of life. There was also this violation of legal rights. Parents involved in this initiative reported that um, several aspects of their civil rights have been violated throughout this process. Arriving at the scene in which their child was murdered, we saw that parents face police brutality and police mistreatment, and this could be not having the access to touch their child or to um, access their remains, or even being questioned and berated by law enforcement officers while they're instantly grieving the death of their child. Um, and one of the things that emerged from this mistreatment and from this police brutality is this idea of advocacy. There was an emphasis on parents reporting that they believe that individuals should be responsible in hospitals, and also law enforcement officers should be responsible for receiving additional training and additional guidance, and having an advocate present to speak to officers and speak to surgeons about some of these legal questions that they're being asked, why they have the time to grieve. Another thing that emerged is this aspect of betrayal. Some parents report and feeling betrayal and angered with the criminal justice system, given that um, some of the parents involved in the study, their children were taken by police officers, by police officer gun violence, and the aspect of the police being uh, placed in the community with the idea and the premise of to serve and protect, and the idea of their children losing their lives from the same sworn officer. And one of the things that emerged from each of these topics, whether it been trauma, whether it been grief, whether it been a violation of rights, is these aspects of the strength-based aspects relating to some of the aspects I talked about before, meaning focused coping, post-traumatic growth, and activism. We know that parents in these meetings, after sharing their trauma and their grief, had the opportunity to talk about some of the advocacy that they think should be in place. And we also saw that parents in these meetings had appreciation for relationships, which is relating to a variable to post-traumatic growth, having a sense of gratitude for the relationships that's been fostered during the grieving process, and with with a collective of other survivors, with mothers who lost their children to gun violence. And with this aspect of loss and being a person being extracted from their life, we also see this variable of community organizing. A lot of the parents have engaged in social justice activism by taking an oath and making a deliberate action, an intentional action to say, I will be involved with a neighborhood watch committee. I will be on the advisory neighborhood commission and being responsible and involved with these roles. We see parents have hosted, whether it be weekly marches, sit-ins for the communities to talk about violence, but also hold a space for other parents who've lost their children to gun violence while coping by prioritizing their core beliefs about empathy and holding that space for other parents. Um, so here's some of the predominant themes in more detail, which I'll speak towards for this aspect of community organizing and social justice activism. The parents reported that staff trauma surgeons should be trained to be more grief informed and more trauma informed, and that community interventions should be in place to combat police brutality, as that would have made a differentiating factor in some of these parents' lives. Also, they emphasize the role of counteracting some of the violence that happens in the communities with education, prevention services for youth, and mental health resources for families impacted by violence. And this idea of meaning focused coping emerged from the empathy that some of these parents had for other individuals who lost their lives, wanting to create organizations, holding spaces for other families to come to them and grieve, and also embodying some community mothering practices, being able to, even though they lost their child to gun violence, whether that been their only child or they had multiple children, going back into the communities in which they know are plagued by violence and finding ways to mentor and to foster and to parent other children that they know may be at risk for violence. So these are some of the themes that emerge from these meetings that we had. And I also want to take time to center the voices and direct quotes of some of these mothers that were courageous and brave enough to even put words to their experiences. For advocacy, one of the things that one of the mothers mentioned was she recounted her experiences around being at the hospital, learning that her child had passed away to gun violence. And she stated that I got a phone call from donors, and they wanted me to donate parts of my son's body. Um, and I think that was, she said, I think that was very insensitive because I didn't even know my son was dead. And she described that she thinks it's important for medical professionals to have trained uh, protocols surrounding grief-informed practices and having somebody to talk to a parent and speak to a parent about what it means to lose the death of a loved one. For post-traumatic growth, one of the parents reported like after enduring the experience of being exposed to the violence and losing their child, and also enduring some of these interactions with medical professionals, they reported that being in this program, they described that as a grandmother, she was ostracized from a lot of the resources that were available to parents. She stated, when this program came along, I was a grandmother, but this child had spent the most of the time with me, but nobody was willing to give me the resources I needed. So thank you. And the mother also, that one of the other mothers also reported, thank God that one of her neighbors was in law school at the time. So we see that in the midst of these parents enduring something traumatic, losing their child to gun violence, having to deal with the trauma and grief persisting for years, we see these parents have appreciation for some of the things that stem from their traumatic experiences, whether it be the relationships that were developed throughout the programmatic aspects or the individuals that were surrounding them during the times of um, the traumatic experience. Um, and another aspect of social justice activism that one of them was reported is she stated that I approached the police several times back then, and when we first had neighborhood watch, and they used to call us the Orange Hats. And she also reported that she served as a neighborhood commissioner. So some of these parents have took a meaningful role to fill the gaps in which elected officials, politicians, neighborhood safety organizations haven't been able to um, fill the shoes of, they haven't been able to address. And this and work being involved with social activism directly in the community helps those individuals cope with some of the processes that accompany grief and trauma. And this last one that I wanted to mention with meaning focused coping, one of the mothers said, now I work with the state's attorney offices. So I interact with police officers a lot and can make a difference. And one of the mothers also mentioned that they host a family day every September to commemorate the loss of their children. So with this aspect of meaning focused coping prior to the death of her son, uh, the mother in particular that mentioned this quote, um, did not have any engagement with law enforcement agencies, and now this mother is working for state's attorney offices and directly interacts with police officers to advocate for other parents who may be at risk for losing their children. And this aspect of community organizing, hosting an annual space for parents to grieve and to process some of their experiences was a big thing as well. So I wanted to take this time to center the direct voices of these mothers and their ideas and their inspirational contributions to their experiences, but also to some of the areas that are most affected. So as some of the direct outcomes that I also want to give weight and attention towards is some of the achievements and accomplishments that Black mothers involved in the Brave Behind the Bullet have been able to go out and achieve after being involved with this program. So as I discussed before, there's been an increase in social justice activism organization uh, engagement. Two of the parents involved in the testimony meetings have begun to start their own organizations devoted towards bereaved parents who lost children to gun violence. And that's an example of social justice activism encouraging in the space of being able to talk to a council member or an individual elected official and have their voices centered, gave them the intrinsic motivation and the opportunity to go out and to want to devote their own experiences towards this cause. For me to focus coping, one of the parents in the program is an artist and reported creating and selling some of her artwork as a way to tribute and grieve her son's death. And if you can see on the slide, I have some pictures of this mother's art, just beautiful work that is stemmed from some of the trauma and the grief that she's experienced. But every piece of her art has a piece of her son. And that's one of the things that's powerful with this rich data surrounding meaning focused coping, finding a way to process, transmute, and use this energy and this grief that may be uh, deeply entangled in a person's identity and being able to express it on a canvas. The last thing I wanted to report with post-traumatic growth outcomes is that one of the mothers involved in the yearly meetings, the testimony meetings, has been a part of Georgetown Law in the committee surrounding the Office of Justice and Victim Services. She serves as a policy committee member, advocating for families whose rights have been violated in the hospitals. So one of the mothers also has been able to get involved with politics and find ways to inform policy that will impact other families as well. And this is that example of post-traumatic growth by embracing, integrating that traumatic experience, but embracing new opportunities professionally to go forth and say, this traumatic experience has impacted me, and I'm gonna use it as an opportunity to integrate it, process it, and make a meaningful change. So these are some of the programmatic outcomes that I wanted to share about the effectiveness of how this program has been working. And also, I just wanted to mention some of the things that and the significance of this program that I think are important and some of the next steps that I will take to advance this research, particularly with this qualitative aspect of evaluating the program and knowing what impact it has on. The next steps I want to take is to identify how some specific variables relating to post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress and grief um, moderate these experiences for parents. So one of my next steps that I will take is focusing on looking at some moderation and mediation analysis to get the quantitative data to substantiate some of the qualitative data that I mentioned today. And secondly, I think one of the things that was important throughout doing this work is having the opportunity to reconceptualize some of the Eurocentric understandings of what it means to grieve and also to experience something traumatic. I think the examples of engaging in social justice activism, relying on grassroots community organizations, finding ways to cope, whether it be through artwork or oral tradition or you speaking your mind at in a room full of politicians with other mothers that have experienced something similar, it gives weight and attention towards the fact that some of these aspects of coping need to be understood through a strength-based lens and understanding how some of this aspect of artwork or history, community organizing plays a significant role culturally in what it means for a Black mother to heal from losing their child to gun violence. Um, and another through two steps that I think that I will use this work to try to bolster and continue to advocate for is to prove some of the mental health services allocated towards Black mothers and fathers um, who lost children to gun violence. Given that there's a disproportionate aspect of resource access, one of the things that I hope this program is able to do is advocate for parents who lost their children to gun violence by giving them the opportunity to engage in social justice, receive psychotherapeutic resources, but also and motivate them to get involved in making some permanent changes with policy and having these two overarching goals of restoring some of the equity that has been lost and giving them liberatory coping mechanisms. Um, so that's some of the significance of the work and some of the impact and ways I hope to continue to uh, advance the Brave Behind the Bullet initiative. And that concludes my presentation. And I'll stop sharing my screen to open it up for questions and comments. But I thank you all for listening first and foremost. And then if you have any questions surrounding anything that was on the slides, I can reshare it as well.
Thank you very much, Denzell. It was really inspiring. It was also tough at some points, but it was very important for all of us to actually listen and to understand and not just the concepts, but also how your idea developed over time and why you are doing what you are doing in such a way. I just wanted to briefly just say one comment because I also work a lot on trauma, especially in Bosnia after the war. We also, what I liked about when you said that actually you don't want this Eurocentric measurement of PTSD. I remember that we had a problem in Bosnia also because those are like these, how we call them, weird concepts developed in Western and industrialized countries that actually don't work on non-weird people in non-weird countries. So we also had that problem with the inventory. But what I also liked when you said, when I will quote it actually, I was taking some notes when you said that parents, about parents and their like the sessions that they have together and those copings and meaningful copings that they do together. And you said this sentence like appreciation for relationships that they have been fostering during the grieving process. It is actually also in line with the previous research on post-traumatic growth, where they actually discovered that those who were able to talk about their trauma with the people who went through similar or same trauma had that opportunity to develop post-traumatic growth. The problem was with, for instance, soldiers who returned from the military or to the battlefield, and then they simply felt that their family members and their friends and peers couldn't understand them well because they didn't share the same trauma as they experienced. So that is also a very strong point where we understand this social activism that I described at the very beginning, like why it is important to organize supportive groups for parents, especially for mothers, where they can actually talk about their pain. We all know that for like the biggest pain for mother is to lose a child, and especially each one of them has their own understanding of trauma. But actually, when they share it, I'm quite sure that they find some like points where they understand each other and where they can basically talk towards like further understanding and healing that which leads to growth. So that was my only comment actually. But now I would like the audience to ask questions and to have comments and recommendations too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening and raising that point. I think that's extremely important, and that's one of the things I wanted to drive home by presenting today. But any other questions? And I'm sorry for time. I get lost in this topic because I'm so passionate about it. I know it's 11:55, but
I think time is great.
okay.
I'd like to say that it was your presentation. It's like a huge contribution that you've made in developing this, and I really appreciate it. And it has relevance in so many areas. I'm thinking of people who lose children to drugs, drug overdose. I'm in Canada, and we have an Indigenous community where similar kinds of trauma are occurring, and it's just a profoundly useful picture that you or way of approaching things that you've developed. I'm wondering though what kinds of supports and what kinds of struggles you personally have had in developing it, and if there's something that is relevant that stands out that perhaps is useful to hear about.
Yes. First, yeah, thank you for mentioning that, making that connection between parents who lost children to drug use. I think that's extremely important, and as it relates to the life being taken and how that grieving process is impacted. And me personally, the challenge that I have faced is being able to make sure and ensure that I'm holding space for myself, and making sure that I'm able to have time to uh, whether it be attending therapy myself or taking time to meditate, or also trying to find ways to integrate some of the trauma that I have experienced and making sure that's not being transferred or showing up in spaces that I know that is predominantly Black mothers or parents. Because one of the ways I also intend to approach the work, or instead of approaching the work, is understanding that my positionality, right? I'll never know what it means to be a Black mother and lose their child to gun violence. I'll never walk a day in their shoes. So really putting words to that, and that's what helps me to be able to draw those boundaries and also ensure that I'm coming in these communities with that intentionality in that way, if that answers your question.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you.
No problem.
Robin, you're muted. I think you're saying something.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. That's a very important sort of condensation of that kind of experience. I'm in Oakland, and another one of the murder capitals in the United States. And I really was impressed about the words in your word cloud that came up of community, neighborhood, and village, which is the work that Steve and I are colleagues are doing with the scale of healing and the sort of administrative unit size that is even capable of addressing violence and institutional violence and positive peace. I mean, because you've connected the two directly. That from the worst case, most traumatic situation, immediately to to improving the situation, so that is what our research is showing. Also, it's got to be small scale, direct interaction and interplay, and to build on what Steve said, is there, what kind of support will you need to keep this kind of work going is one question, and how do you see these institutions respond? Because that's something I see in Oakland all the time, and I'm sure it's everywhere, is these built-in barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that barrier aspect and some of these things that like is needed for the support. And one of my main ways of supporting and sustaining this work is being able to partner with individuals that are devoted towards the cause and the work without any dollar amount attached to it. One of the things that has been sustaining this work for me is being able to apply to grants and be able to secure grants and to allocate that money directly towards that cause. And one that the institution responses from the institution is um, to try to change the work to make it more how can I say, like not directly tied to community organizing and social justice activism, to kind of how can I say it, like education orient the work. And one of the pushbacks that I've had towards that is that the work in the community comes from lived experiences and the rich experience of what it means to, sit with that person throughout this process. But I've also had some good institutional responses. As you might have noted throughout the presentation, I'm working closely with Georgetown University Law School and the Office of Victim Services now to try to get a multi-year grant to sustain the efforts and to also include in the budget of that grant ways that I can devote and allocate funding to the nonprofit organizations that some of the mothers have founded. So trying to give other organizations that same platform, that same access to some of the resources that I have through my organization as well. So just to recreate that ripple effect of people doing the work and people that, particularly the mothers and people directly impacted, because that's where the most, I believe the most change in meaningful works comes from. So thank you for that question.
Any more questions or comments? Some maybe recommendations for Denzell's thesis?
Well, again,
I think also Professor Kristen wanted to say something, so maybe like Robin and then, yeah.
Oh, you're asking me. Have you looked at where you might try to publish this to make sure that the information, you have an incredible wealth of information here. And I'm trying to think whether when you're publishing, which you definitely should try to do to get it out, whether you need to break it down into 2 articles so it's manageable or what. Have you got someone helping with that?
Yes, yeah. My dissertation advisor has been helpful with, trying to help me understand what this, like how to present it in an article form. And I think, like you said, I think breaking it up into 2 manuscripts would be best. I'm possibly looking at trying to integrate the 2 because I have like a quantitative focus and more of a qualitative focus, and maybe getting to the point where I have a mixed methods proposal or thing being publicated. But right now, I know some of the stuff that I mentioned in the slide was mainly just like evaluation of the program, not even research related, because I know that was focused on just intervention wise, and as opposed to more this is systematic investigation of research. But yeah, to answer your question, probably two manuscripts and maybe one focused on some of that mixed methods to integrate some of the data with quantitative work as well.
Robin, you wanted to say something, sorry.
Well, I was struck by how similar your experiences are to what I've been running into for the last 50 years. Dealing with institutions and urban planning and the lack of emotional understanding of basically anything. And also I'm glad you brought up this sort of quantitative versus qualitative. It seems like these experiences are so similar. I mean, here we're talking about, you know, the West Coast, the East Coast, Canada, Europe, and Eastern Europe, and if you get enough, you know, qualitative experiences that sound exactly like each other, doesn't that begin to become quantitative?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it seems, yeah, counting, you know, head counting when people are getting shot, you know, sort of seems irrelevant at the moment. You know, but after, you know, after enough time, you get enough identical situations, which I think reminds me of your organization that you started, Alma, about the you know, large group research. Or I mean, this is an example right here of multiple people and places who've never met each other coming up with similar, very similar results.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one thing that stood out to me was what you said, if you get enough qualitative data across multiple entities, then it becomes quantitative. And the thing, you know, taking that a step further is like, how do you, and then that's why I get to the point of mixed methods. How do we make that quantitative and qualitative coalesce to say something even more meaningful and to uh substantiate the work with statistical analysis that speak to both, because you can't have one without the other. You can't give somebody like a scale and say, oh yeah, on a scale of 1 to 5, strongly disagree and agree, and you only get part of the story. It's like you don't get the answer of why that person strongly disagrees, what makes them strongly disagrees, what brought them to strongly disagree. That's when, you know, the qualitative data comes in. So mixed methods is just, you know, a thing that I hope to branch out to and hope to just continue to give light to with this topic in particular too.
Yeah, if I may add, because in my research previously when I was doing my PhD, I actually also did mixed methods. So I did interviews and I also applied some tests and questionnaires. And basically what helped me there was that somehow those complement to each other. But also what I did with the qualitative, with the narratives, I analyzed them as a narratives, but I also actually had researchers, two independent researchers who coded it. And then we got codes and then so quantitative. So we basically like turn the qualitative material into quantitative and analyze it further. But what is good when you get like narratives, especially if you're doing in-depth interviews, is that you can always use qualitative side to develop some quantitative measure of something. I always like to talk about measurement, so I think that this is also like additional value of qualitative data, which is somehow neglected in psychology today, I would say. But I'm quite sure in terms of publishing that you will have like lots of like venues for that. For instance, first one is like psychological trauma, which is like flagship journal of division on trauma psychology. So like I'm sure they would be interested, for instance. But there are also other like outlets that I'm quite sure that they would like be very happy to publish both this and also all your future research on this topic.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I have to go now, but thank you for actually attending this.
Yes, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. It means a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it,
Yes, thank you.
Alma.
So, oh, you're welcome. Actually, in terms of organization, from now on, Student and Early Career Committee of the APA 48 will be having like monthly events. So we are planning to have one grant awardee to present their research actually each month. So now I'm organizing actually speakers for June, then July, August, and so on. Hopefully it will go in that way. But also like everyone else is invited if you would like to present something, or if you would like to offer any other like assistance or expertise, we are always open. So I'm always bothering people with these emails, so like feel free to bother me too.
Thank you.
So if there are no other research questions, I would like actually to close this event. So I'm really grateful to Denzell and his time that he devoted to actually meet with us and to present one part of the research and like a preliminary draft of his future research. So I wish you all the best, and I hope that, like, of course, we're gonna stay in touch. So I hope, and I'm convinced that basically that will be like that you will get a normal set of data, and that we will be seeing you probably again in maybe a year or so here to present more of what you obtained.
Yes, thank you all. And I appreciate just having the space to just talk about it and see that other people are doing similar work. Um, just thank you. I appreciate it. And keep doing the work. Keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you very much. And as I said at the beginning, every research is partially me research, and also what is very appreciated in psychological research is socially engaged research and activism, and that is what we got today. So thank you all. I will now stop recording.